At 2:17 on a freezing Thursday morning, my younger sister Kylie stood in my Chicago entryway, holding the keys to my SUV, demanding I confess to a hit and run. She had pressured me into lending her my vehicle earlier that afternoon, claiming her sports car couldn't handle the incoming blizzard. I could picture the damage: a shattered headlight, a dark scrape, a thin red mark on the hood. Before I could speak, my parents, Robert and Eleanor, shoved past her. They ordered me to take the fall to protect Kylie's political campaign. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I had always been the silent investor in their version of a family, holding on to worthless shares while they paid dividends to their favorite child. I am 33 years old, and I work as a federal prosecutor. Years ago, I walked away from the high society corporate track controlled by my father, Robert. That decision made me the family outcast. My career wasn't a respectable asset on their balance sheet. It was a liability. Kylie, on the other hand, was their blue-chip stock. At 28, she was an ambitious corporate attorney and a rising political star. Her campaign for a high-profile city office was completely backed by my mother Eleanor's community boards and my father's crisis management expertise. She was the golden investment. Standing in my hallway, Kylie was hyperventilating, but her panic wasn't about the life she had just endangered on an icy Chicago street. It was about her poll numbers. She recounted how the tires lost traction, how she struck a man, and how she panicked and kept driving. There was no remorse, only a calculation of risk. My father didn't ask if the victim was alive. He didn't ask if someone had called an ambulance. Instead, Robert went straight into crisis management mode. He started pacing my living room floor, immediately drafting a script for me to recite to the police. He reasoned that a prosecutor with a clean record and no political aspirations could absorb a misdemeanor leaving the scene charge with a plea deal and community service. He prioritized campaign optics over a human life. It was a cold equation where Kylie's future equaled everything and mine equaled zero. He laid out the timeline, the fabricated motive for my late-night drive, and the specific precinct where I would surrender. My mother stood beside him, nodding, her face set in that perfectly composed mask she wore to charity galas. She chimed in to remind me that this was my duty. I listened to them negotiate the terms of my ruin as if they were haggling over a corporate merger. They weren't asking for a favor. They were calling in a debt I didn't owe. Love, in this family, had always been a subscription service, and they were finally handing me the bill. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. Kylie shivered in her expensive wool coat, clutching her designer bag as a shield against the consequences of vehicular assault. Robert and Eleanor stood united, an impenetrable wall of wealthy arrogance. They genuinely believed my life was a cheap commodity, easily traded to protect their pristine public image. They built their entire empire on manipulating the truth, expecting me to be another perfectly placed brick in their foundation of lies. They assumed I would fold, that the lifelong conditioning of being the disposable daughter would kick in. But this wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and I was about to audit their entire operation. I watched my father outline my fabricated guilt, his voice steady, completely blind to the fact that I had stopped playing along. I was no longer the frightened child seeking their validation. I was a federal attorney evaluating a crime. My father stopped pacing and pointed directly at me. He demanded I surrender my phone and delete all communication channels immediately to prevent investigators from finding inconsistencies in my location data. He wanted total control of the narrative, assigning roles to each of us like a tyrannical director staging a play. As he laid out this fabricated confession plan, the cognitive dissonance in the room was staggering. This is the architecture of family denial. Narcissistic parents pathologically view the scapegoated child as utterly disposable. In their minds, they are the protagonists of reality, meaning any action taken to preserve their status is inherently justified. To Robert and Eleanor, sacrificing my career and my freedom wasn't an act of malice, it was basic household management. They didn't see me as a daughter being thrown to the wolves. They saw me as a firewall designed to burn so that the main server could remain untouched. Their empathy was heavily compartmentalized, accessible only to those who amplified their ego. I was merely utility, a necessary casualty for the greater good of the Hayes family name. But they were calculating with outdated data. They didn't know that 3 months ago, I had successfully prosecuted a mid-level enforcer in an organized crime syndicate. Following a series of credible threats against my life, the Federal Marshal Service had upgraded my vehicle. My SUV wasn't just a car anymore. It was equipped with an advanced, federally synced dash camera system and a cloud preservation lock. It recorded constantly. Even as they stood in my apartment demanding my phone, my watch vibrated silently against my wrist. It was a series of encrypted security notifications. The system was confirming that every single exterior frame of the impact, every precise GPS coordinate of the route, and every crystal-clear interior audio snippet from the cabin had been successfully uploaded and locked down on a secure federal server. The data was completely untouchable. It could not be edited, paused, or deleted, not even by me. I looked at the three of them, watching them meticulously plot a cover-up that was already obsolete. I didn't interrupt their frantic planning. I let them dig the hole deeper. Eleanor suggested I wear my glasses to the precinct to look more sympathetic. Kylie offered to pay my legal fees, framing it as a generous act of sisterly solidarity. Every word they spoke was another deposit into their own prosecution file. The absolute precision of the trap was beautiful. They were so blinded by their own assumed supremacy that they never bothered to ask if the scapegoat had grown teeth. My silence wasn't submission, it was data collection. They wanted to strip away my phone to hide my tracks, entirely unaware that the federal government already had a high-definition front-row seat to their golden child's felony. I stood perfectly still, letting the silent vibrations on my wrist dictate the rhythm of my inevitable retaliation. I kept my expression strictly neutral. I was calculating the mandatory minimums for leaving the scene of an accident with serious bodily injury, then multiplying it by the compounding charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. My father clapped his hands together, signaling that the meeting was concluded and the plan was set. He held out his hand, waiting for me to hand over my device. While my father waited with his hand outstretched, my television, muted in the background, switched to the breaking news alert. A reporter stood on a sleet-covered intersection, the flashing lights of an ambulance painting the icy road red and blue. I reached for the remote and turned up the volume, overriding my father's demands. The news anchor announced that a pedestrian had been critically injured in a hit-and-run just after midnight. The victim's name flashed across the lower third of the screen: Samuel Ortiz. He was 61 years old. The reporter added a detail that sucked the oxygen completely out of the room. Samuel Ortiz wasn't just a random late-night walker. He was a senior compliance investigator for the state's Financial Oversight Board. I recognized the name instantly. Ortiz was the exact man who was days away from exposing massive, systemic financial irregularities within Robert Hayes' prestigious law firm. The implications crashed down like shattered glass. This wasn't just a tragic accident born of reckless driving on black ice. Kylie didn't just hit a random stranger in a panic. She had run down the very man actively investigating her father's corruption. The cold, clinical retaliation in my mind sharpened into a razor edge. This was no longer just a hit and run. It was attempted murder, obstruction, and a corporate cover-up of epic proportions. The frantic attempts by my parents to spin the narrative completely shattered. The simple misdemeanor plan evaporated. My father's authoritative posture crumbled as he stared at the television, the color draining from his face. The calculation of risk had just gone bankrupt. Before Robert could pivot to a new lie, the heavy oak door of my apartment, which they hadn't fully latched in their rush, was pushed open. A young man stumbled into the entryway. It was Julian, Kylie's campaign associate. He was trembling violently, his expensive overcoat ruined, and a stark smear of dried blood ran down the left side of his forehead. He looked at Kylie, then at my parents, and finally at me. He was breathing heavily, visibly in shock. Julian didn't wait for introductions or excuses. He confessed immediately. He admitted to being the passenger in my SUV during the crash. He stated clearly, his voice echoing in the silent apartment, that he had begged Kylie to hit the brakes. He had screamed at her to stop after the impact, but she had aggressively accelerated, threatening to destroy his career if he ever spoke a word. Julian's arrival was the final nail. Their neat, contained conspiracy was bleeding out on my hardwood floor. Kylie screamed at him to shut up, her polished political facade completely dissolving into vicious panic. She lunged forward, trying to physically silence him, but my father pulled her back. The balance of power had violently shifted. The narrative they tried to control was a burning building, and they were locked inside. I stood motionless, absorbing every word, every admission, every panicked breath. The accounting was nearly complete. I didn't offer Julian a towel or a glass of water. My response remained strictly analytical. I cataloged his statement as a corroborating witness testimony. My family had brought this war into my home, assuming I was unarmed. They were horribly mistaken. Cornered and desperate, Kylie turned her venom entirely on me. Her voice dropped into a vicious, ragged sneer. She pointed her finger inches from my face and threatened to call the police herself right then and there. She swore she would tell the authorities I had been driving, that I had stolen my own car in a jealous rage to sabotage her campaign, and that Julian was lying because he was secretly in love with me. It was an unhinged, pathetic attempt at leverage, a desperate gamble by a toxic narcissist who realized she was losing control. She screamed that it was 2 against 1, that no one would believe the resentful, outcast sister over a beloved political candidate and her prestigious parents. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned my back on her and walked calmly down the hall to my private office. I grabbed the brass handle and flung the door wide open. Hanging prominently on the wall, directly illuminated by the desk lamp, were my framed credentials. It was my formal appointment documentation, signed and sealed by the Chief Judge of the Federal District Court, officially designating me as an Assistant United States Attorney. I stepped aside, forcing them to look at the undeniable proof of my authority. I was not just their disappointing daughter. I was an officer of the United States federal court system. My father stormed down the hall, his face purple with rage. He demanded I use my legal discretion and my connections within the system to erase the police report, to manipulate the evidence, to fix the mess. He ordered me to do my job for the family. Instead of answering, I picked up my tablet from the desk. I opened the encrypted federal cloud application. I authenticated the biometric lock and mirrored the screen to my large desktop monitor. I pressed play. The unalterable video filled the room. The high-definition dashcam footage showed the dark, icy street, the terrifying impact with Samuel Ortiz, and the immediate, aggressive acceleration away from the scene. But it was the interior audio that served as the true executioner. The cabin microphone had captured everything with crystal clarity. Kylie's slurred voice echoed from the speakers, cursing the victim for being in her way. We heard Julian screaming, begging her to hit the brakes, pleading with her to pull over and call an ambulance. And we heard Kylie's chilling response, threatening to ruin his life if he didn't shut his mouth and help her frame me. The room went absolutely dead silent. The audio stopped, leaving only the soft hum of the computer fan. The heavy realization crashed down on them simultaneously. The scapegoat they had mocked and dismissed for a decade now held absolute institutional power over their freedom, their finances, and their futures. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I closed the application, securing the files behind the federal encryption wall once again. "This is no longer a family matter," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "This is a federal evidence preservation locker. And you are all currently trespassing at a crime scene." I reached for my desk phone. By 3:03 in the morning, the retaliation was complete. There was no screaming, no dramatic confrontation on my part. I simply dialed my colleague, a senior FBI agent I frequently worked with, who immediately locked down the evidence and contacted the Major Crimes Unit on my behalf. Within hours, major crime detectives were executing no-knock search warrants on all electronics and household devices across the various Hayes family properties. The fallout was swift, relentless, and absolute. Kylie's political campaign imploded overnight. The unedited dashcam footage clearly showing her drinking heavily from a silver flask while driving and callously ignoring Julian's frantic pleas to stop was securely handed over to federal and state investigators. It didn't take long for the press to obtain the arrest records. Her rising political star burned up in the atmosphere of her own staggering arrogance. Robert's prestigious law firm collapsed almost instantly under the crushing weight of emergency federal investigations into the massive financial irregularities Samuel Ortiz had uncovered. High-profile clients fled, senior partners resigned in panic, and the firm's glass doors were padlocked by federal agents. Eleanor, totally stripped of her pristine social standing, was unceremoniously forced off every single charity board she chaired. Their vast, powerful social circle evaporated within days, leaving them completely isolated in their ruined glass tower. A week later, my mother appeared at my office unannounced, crying and pleading for a reunion. She begged me to withdraw my cooperation with the investigation, claiming it was time to let go of anger and just find peace as a family. I looked at her from across my heavy oak desk, recognizing the exact psychological tactic she was employing. This is the weaponization of peace. Toxic systems always demand forgiveness, not for genuine healing, but for their own convenience. They use the concept of peace as a manipulative tool of suppression, a calculated way to silence the victim and reset the cycle of abuse, without ever demanding any actual accountability from the abuser. When a toxic family member begs for peace, what they are actually demanding is your total submission. They want you to absorb their guilt so they don't have to carry the heavy burden of their actions. I refuse to be their emotional landfill any longer. Cutting ties wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. True peace isn't merely the absence of conflict, it is the active presence of justice. I calmly told Eleanor that my door was permanently closed, both professionally and personally. I pressed the intercom and instructed building security to escort her out of the lobby. I didn't feel a shred of guilt watching her leave. The transaction was finalized. The contract was terminated. My family gambled their entire legacy on the arrogant assumption that I would remain weak and compliant. They entirely failed to realize that the years of cold isolation had only forged my resolve into something unbreakable. The glass tower they built on a foundation of lies was completely shattered, and I was the one who swung the hammer. Months later, the criminal proceedings officially concluded. The legal machinery I had dedicated my life to operated with cold efficiency. Kylie was convicted and now faces a severe prison sentence for vehicular assault, leaving the scene, and obstruction of justice. The political future she prized above human life is permanently gone. My father, Robert, saw his professional standing permanently revoked. He was disbarred, his once impeccable reputation reduced to a cautionary tale in Chicago's legal circles. Eleanor retreated into bitter, absolute isolation, living in a sprawling house that suddenly felt hollow and empty. As for me, I sold the SUV. I wanted no lingering physical reminders of that night or the family I had finally severed ties with. I purchased a quiet, sunlit house just outside the city limits. The very first thing I did when I moved in was hang my federal prosecutor credentials proudly in the entryway. They serve as a daily reminder of who I am and the power of standing firmly in my own truth. Looking back on the wreckage, I've come to realize that surviving a toxic family isn't about winning a war. It's about having the courage to finally walk off the battlefield entirely. For so long, I believed that endurance was my greatest strength. I thought that if I could just withstand the coldness, if I could just bear the weight of being the outcast, I would eventually earn my place. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from a debt you never owed in the first place. I want to speak directly to you now, whoever is listening to this. Perhaps you are sitting in the dark right now, feeling like the designated scapegoat in a system designed to systematically diminish you. Perhaps you are exhausted from carrying the heavy burden of someone else's secrets. Please hear my voice and know that you are not alone. You do not owe your sanity to people who refuse to acknowledge your humanity. Your quiet compliance is not a required payment for familial love. Setting an unshakable boundary might feel terrifying. It might feel like you are deliberately tearing your own world apart, but sometimes you have to step back and let the glass tower collapse so you can finally breathe the open air. Healing begins the moment you realize your worth is not dictated by their inability to value you. The truest form of justice isn't always a dramatic courtroom victory or a resounding gavel strike. Sometimes, justice is simply choosing yourself. walking away without looking back, and building a beautiful, quiet life where their toxic shadows can no longer reach you. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, fiercely and unapologetically. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dives into human resilience and justice.